Hey everyone, this is Lonlily. This is part 2 into my descent into madness for DHC Starter. Honestly, there are a couple things that I felt like were left undone, so I decided to delve into this once again. Shortly after I finished the previous video, I just decided to go in and lab something, and lo and behold, I was able to get more DHC starters, so I was like, frick it. Why not? To explain the goal of this video, I'm simply trying to see how many characters you can set up a DHC starter with. I didn't explain very well last time how you actually get DHC starters, so I will here. The prerequisite condition to activate a DHC is for a super to make contact with the opponent's active character. This can be a hit, but can also work on block. Making contact is a deceptively weird state. Hitting the super on an assist, deployable move, or persona will not let you DHC, though hitting any of those and hitting the point will work. Invulnerability obviously doesn't count as making contact, but parries and guard points still count. Different supers also have different windows to DHC. In general, you can call it DHC for as long as your point character is still unactionable due to recovering from the super. On hit, most animation supers will also lock out DHC, but this won't be relevant to us as we don't want these supers to actually hit in the first place. I'll go over how you actually get DHC starters realistically, but there are plenty of ways to set them up. Just for the sake of this video and the previous video, as long as it's not actually cheating, I allow for almost any setup to be legal for this experiment. The main difference between this video and the last one is that I will not just be using Aria's DHC. I knew the main limiting factor with her was the fact that her DHC is quite active and has a sizable amount of recovery. This made it impossible to set up with most characters. I allowed for the entire roster, so all 53 characters were in play. That being said, I did make some obvious exclusions, not because they were like ban-worthy or anything like that, but just because I knew that they wouldn't work out. Most, if not all, cinematic supers were going to be unviable for this experiment. They have lengthy animations that kill any potential follow-ups. They also tend to standardize the opponent's position, which is intentionally done so they don't fall out of the animation. This also has the downside of most DHCs being nearly impossible to pick up from. On the other side, there are plenty of non-cinematic DHCs that are severely long and kill any opportunity to convert off them anyways. To get the best results, I focused on single-hit, non-cinematic DHCs. I narrowed in on 19 characters that I thought were suitable. This is still a lot of characters, and since I was actively going to test with every partner, I ultimately just wanted a lab with the most ideal conditions, so I just selected 2. There were 2 main factors that I looked for: recovery speed and the hitbox. I knew from experience that with Ori, the large vertical hitbox of her DHC did give me quite a bit of leeway with some characters. I also looked for DHCs with relatively low recovery, just so I was able to convert in tight situations. Most characters can fulfill one, but not the other. Yang, for example, has quite low amount of recovery, and while this makes it useful for converting off tight setups, the low verticality would severely limit my options. On the other hand, Mitsuru has one of the highest vertical hitboxes for a DHC, but suffered from severe recovery. After testing around, I ultimately settled on Hard Weiss. Weiss was my first initial choice. I knew she had a large vertical hitbox on her DHC, but after checking the dust loop, I was shocked, to say the least. Even though Weiss suffers from 61 frames of recovery after using the DHC, I knew that this wasn't a ton of recovery, and the vertical hitbox was just too insane not to consider her. Hart also has a really great DHC. Out of all the single-hitting DHCs, she has the fastest recovery, and it has a noticeably large hitbox. Nothing too fancy really, but it fulfilled both criteria. Despite Hard and Weiss being my choices, they aren't technically the best ones. I actually opted to ban 2 characters in specific for this project, because I thought they'd make things a little too easy. The first ban I made was Chie. On the surface, Chie doesn't have anything super special going on with her DHC, but you can solo convert off it with no fuss, no setup, and not even a counter hit. Just opted to ban her to keep things interesting. The other one was Teddy. In theory, I could just set his item to buckets, call 4P, and super on anyone's block, and just frame trap with Teddy's super. While in hindsight, this probably would have been fine to allow, I didn't necessarily want to rely on this either. Though Teddy's frame data does actually make him a really useful choice otherwise. With the 2 characters I wanted to test chosen, I went ahead and started labbing. Several days later. So, Yeah, it turns out Hard and Weiss can actually convert off pretty much every super in the game. Okay, I know that sounds a little far-fetched, but I promise you it's true, at least considering the limitations that I put for this. First, let's go over some of the characters that I thought were theoretically possible with Aria, but are now relatively easy with Weiss and Hart. One of the misses with the previous video was Noelle236BC. The setup is relatively easy with Hart and Weiss, but it is actually possible with Aria. Hyde with Palebringer had a small gap in between the first and second hit, assuming you parried the first with a Kotsky. Aria's DAC lasted a little too long, but a single hit super will easily do the trick. Hilda also had a small gap, but it was too small for Aria to convert off of. Hart and Weiss get this easily though. Jane gave me a lot of agony due to the Snowflake always hitting first with Aria, but with other characters I can completely avoid this by putting the Snowflake slightly above the opponent. Aquaman's orb when he slashes a projectile I theorized could work out, but it never lasted long enough with Aria. This is kind of a specific setup since it needs a lingering projectile to work, but I felt pretty smart thinking about it. Both versions of Yuzu's 236BC also allow for some small gaps. Kind of funny how the super does the little follow-up at the end, even if the first hit doesn't connect, unlike her other super. This also allows Hart to do a full charge 5B, which is pretty neat. Funnily enough, I think Aria probably would get an easy DHC starter combo, but since I wanted to keep things within the scope of possibility, I didn't test it. Here's a normal version at least. Thanks to Weiss and Hart's DHCs not being considered a projectile, one of the new things I can use in this round of testing is Yukiko's DP. I'll play them all in the background, but in the meantime, since they're all pretty similar, I'd like to discuss a distinct advantage of single-hit DHCs. Unlike multi-hit DHCs, the single-target DHCs are very easy to tell if they work out or not. If you don't see 2,200 damage anywhere, you know 100% that isn't a DHC starter. This saves me quite a bit of time. I no longer have to constantly check if the DH starter is valid or not by skipping frame by frame. I can just see the moment the DHC actually hits them. I did notice in my testing, however, when DHC and the super did manage to hit on the same frame, it seemed like the super had the advantage there in this situation. This is something that kind of happened with Aria, but seems to be pretty consistent with the single-hit DHCs. I guess why this is the case, it seems like multi-target DHCs can, like, maybe hit in between frames, which allows them to have priority there in this situation, but I'm not entirely sure. Thankfully, this is never a problem with Yukiko's DP. Since this is entirely projectile guard point, I know that the physical move will always hit first, which should be the DHC. There's a few setups that I think are worth talking about, though. Hyde's Vortex is technically a projectile, and while you don't 100% need it, you can use Yukiko here to just make things a lot easier. Rachel can easily set up both supers on Yukiko's DP, so I was like, why not both at the same time? Atom Smasher actually requires a little bit of a different setup. You need to use Asgrowler. Even though the theory and concept are the same, it actually doesn't really work with Yukiko's DP. She guard points for a little too long, and most of Atom Smasher is actually body property outside of the first hit. I don't know why it's like this, but here we are. What might surprise you is that Akihiko's Miziodyne is not something that actually works with any DHC. Regardless of whatever setup I was doing, I just couldn't get it to work for whatever reason. Okay, with all that out of the way, surely I'm done lighting DHC Starter, right? Well, no, not quite. You see, these are some of the more conventional ways that you might get a DHC Starter. Well, as conventional as you might get DHC Starter in an actual match, but I was kind of wondering, like, you know, in theory, you could convert off these DHCs solo if you really tried with no setup. As much as it pains me to say, it's a little more easy than I thought it would be initially. What I've neglected to mention up until now is that Weiss and Hart can just solo convert off their DHCs. It does have a decently strict height requirement, and it needs to be counter hit in most scenarios for it to work, but it is very much doable. So then the real challenge becomes, how can you get a DHC to actually hit them from the specific height and also it be a counter hit? And well, Akatsuki's parry comes into play once again to just cause all this mess to happen. Now before I get too ahead of myself here, I did set one additional stipulation. As you kind of saw from the demonstration earlier, there is a pretty easy way to set up all of these. Just have the super be blocked on the floor, jump up and press a button, and the DHC should be able to convert. So I did add one more condition. I'm not allowed to do this, and I need to trigger some form of parry in order for this to be considered a valid setup. You don't need to do this, of course, but I figured it'd be a nice way to stretch my creative muscles and make me go insane. So the first round of supers I decided to test out were all the air supers. Naturally, since height is the most important requirement for DHC starters, I felt like these were a good place to start. With air supers, it's pretty easy to just dictate whatever height I want the Akatsuki parry to be triggered at, and just punish him on the way down. Now, one might think, because of how close you have to be for some air supers to actually connect, that Akatsuki's parry follow-up will just go ahead and punish them, but for the vast majority of cases, this didn't happen. Yeah, a lot of characters will just also fly past Akatsuki and not punish him either, so this ended up being a lot more perfect of a setup than I could have asked for. That being said, of course, there were a couple exceptions. Heart was the biggest one. Whatever reason, you have to do the super a little below Akatsuki in order for the pair to whiff. If you just do it right next to him, she'll get punished. I guess initially suffered from this problem, but if you space out the super, the persona will actually hit first, and he won't do the follow-up, allowing you to punish on the way down. Just keep in mind, like the previous video, if Akatsuki doesn't trigger his follow-up due to hitting a persona or hitting a projectile with his parry, I am allowed to press a button afterwards. As long as you hear the little click from his parry, pretty much everything afterwards is free game. This is to simulate a punish, but since Akatsuki can do this in actual gameplay, I thought it was fine, even if a bit unrealistic to actually happen. Now the next logical step was to test the supers that hit particularly high, so I thought of Makoto, maybe Carmine, but obviously there are plenty more characters. Hilda's Gravity Squeeze super is basically an air super since it just tracks the entire screen. Blake has deceptively high reach on both of her supers. I'm not super surprised that her wave super is able to hit up there, though the timing is kind of finicky with Heart. That being said, the 214 super actually has deceptively high range. Like, I wasn't expecting it to hit in the sky at all, but good for you, Blake players. You might be surprised that I was surprised that Heart actually has the height with her 236 super to convert off this, but I was. Chie Godfist also has quite a bit of verticality. It kind of makes sense looking at it visually. I've just never seen this come into play ever. Akatsuki's 214 super also hits deceptively high up, though you need to space this out a little bit just to make sure that Akatsuki doesn't get hit by his own parry. Considering how Hotenjin looks, it's probably not a surprise that he can get it, but you have to make sure you hit the tail end of the kick. Ground Dividing Smasher, I was a little surprised that he could get the optimal height with, but in hindsight, it does make sense. Pretty similar story with my 214BC. It looks the same, it kind of functions the same, and even though Divine Smasher is a fist move technically, Big Spear is big. Yosuke Ni does work, and very similarly to the other air super setups, Yosuke will just invul through the parry follow-up, so it works with the air version as well. It's pretty much the same. I've seen Adachi cross slash hit way too high in the air than it really should, so I'm not surprised about this one either. It's just... why? Jubei super is the only super that I tested where Heart actually can't get a DHC starter off it, but Weiss can. Barely though, she needs the 4A. Now, I say the most interesting one for last. Yuki Kaze actually does have a setup. You just need to throw out the fireball and have him parry at a specific height, and then you should be golden. Now that we've covered what does work with Akatsuki's parry, let's cover what doesn't. The first reason is that the super just does not have enough invul to pierce through Akatsuki's invul when he does a follow-up, and they will get hit afterwards. Another reason is just some supers don't have enough verticality to hit Akatsuki at the right height in order to actually set up a DHC starter. We have similar issues with supers that don't trigger his follow-up, Since Akatsuki maintains his momentum, if the super doesn't trigger the follow-up, he'll usually land before I can actually counter-hit him. This is especially difficult with Chie and Jin supers that basically have no time to actually call the DHC. The last reason is actually something that I learned through the course of this experiment, but every single command grab super, even if you parry and the follow-up whiffs on you, just won't let you DHC. So that means every command grab super is unviable for this, with the exception of Elizabeth. For some reason, her command grab super is the only one that lets you call a DHC on parry. My only assumption why this might be the case is since it's a persona-based move, but this is really odd. Thankfully, the combo off it is really easy. You just need to do a bunch of setup with Mudo and Hama, but still just why? With all these conditions, that means Waldstein and Neo are the only characters in the game that I can't seem to get a DHC starter on. Wald just has all command grab supers, so he was out of the picture, but Neo's 236 super doesn't hit high enough in the air, and she has that command grab too. Now, this forced me to be a little more creative with setups and look to other characters. The first character I tried out was Neo. In the last video, I found that Neo couldn't actually call a DHC on her parry, but with the specific Mai setup, this is the only real way I think you can make use of it in this experiment. Despite me fighting this, honestly, afterwards, I was really racking my brain around trying to find ways to set these up, and really just came up with nothing. I honestly thought it was all over, finally. But things never end for me, do they? I was battered, bruised, tired yet relieved. Akatsuki's parry seemed to have been ran out of all its usefulness. Yet, I felt in my soul something yet to be done. And then I remembered. I looked up on the character select screen and saw her. Elizabeth. But what could be done with Elizabeth, I asked. Many, many things. It all started with Heart I Know. No matter how I tried, Heart's DP super just would always trigger Akatsuki's parry. I tried triggering it from many angles, and yet nothing seemed to be working. I even tried Blitztank, who, surprisingly enough, almost got me there, but not quite. But it was in this moment that I knew in my soul that Elizabeth might be able to do something. After all, her DP is notoriously unreliable, and I thought, she does have this weird quirk where she's not facing the same direction as you. She does whiff her follow-up. And so, I lapped it. And from that moment forth, I knew my fate was sealed, that this project was nowhere close to being done yet. Cursed with new knowledge, a deep dark pit formed in my soul. And yet, when I stared into this abyss, all I could mutter was splendid. Alright, insanity aside, what about Liz DP makes her particularly good for setting up DHC starters, especially over Akatsuki? First of all, the momentum/spacing issue that I had with Akatsuki is pretty much a non-problem for Elizabeth. This is because when she presses her parry, she will actually stop her air momentum. In addition too, when you actually trigger her parry, she won't fall down either. This means using any super that has enough verticality for a DHC starter to actually occur will be viable for Elizabeth. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. Elizabeth will still trigger her follow-up on a lot of supers, but the range at which this will happen is really inconsistent, and I really wish I could tell you. Though any super that has enough invul, like Akatsuki, will just go through it. While Elizabeth DP isn't completely necessary for some of these setups coming up, I think it just makes it so much more easier to the point where just using Elizabeth DP is just the optimal choice. I think the best examples of Elizabeth DP being better over Akatsuki DP, at least in terms of ease of use, are just those supers before that had really bad verticality, but just were theoretically high enough where they could set up DHC starter. I think the previous ones can be done with Akatsuki's parry, but This Easy Super, I'm almost certain you need to use Liz. Both of Azrael's supers can trigger Akatsuki's parry rather consistently, but just using Elizabeth is far easier. Don't have to worry about specific spacing, because most of the time the parry follow-up will still hit Azrael. As you saw earlier, Blitztank did struggle with Akatsuki. While it's not impossible per se, it just hits so low to the floor that using Elizabeth parry is just a lot easier. Ruby's super does hit further up in the air, but having to time the Akatsuki parry when she wraps up in her little cloak is a little annoying, so we Elizabeth it. Burning Gold is another one that necessitates the use of Liz DP. It hits too low to the ground, and Akatsuki parry will just punish her. Honestly, I don't know why I tested Akatsuki 2-6 super so late. It works with his own parry, by the way. I've just reached the point where Elizabeth is just easier. Honestly, same situation with Ragna. Definitely could trigger the Akatsuki parry at the right height and not get hit, but Liz! Against those supers that wouldn't trigger Akatsuki's parry from certain heights or ranges, Elizabeth's air stall gives us a big boon here, as we won't have to worry about her falling to the floor before we can DHC her. While previously S did allow us to get a DHC starter off her air super, now with her ground super we can. Izio's 2-6 super had the bad combination of being a projectile and having basically zero verticality, so we can thank Liz for this one too. Unfortunately, Akatsuki's parry will not trigger off Suzuno's sword super despite it being a physical move, but this is circumvented with Liz. Azama's super with Akatsuki's parry didn't even humor us with this being possible, but now it is. Now both the Yukiko supers can work out. In the previous video, I had to do a really weird setup with Tager, but now with Liz's DP as well as Weiss's DHC, it's not so hard. Agidine is also a little weird. You have to hit the DP on the very top of Sakia and make sure that Elizabeth doesn't fall out. This is like basically nigh impossible with Akatsuki, but this is very funny. Now Aegis's ground super works too. Don't really have anything else to add. Even with Liz's DP's air stall, Bloodhouse was still really annoying to hit. I would have figured this would have had a taller hitbox, but no. Akatsuki had no chance. I could probably find an angle where Gord's super works here with Akatsuki's DP, but I'm too lazy. I don't remember testing with Mika's ground version, but I'm pretty sure there is some way to do it with Akatsuki's DP, at least with Weiss and Hart, but this is funny too. Last but not least is Aria. The setup is a little annoying. You have to hit Luminous and Brace towards the tail end and mid-screen, but I'm glad I was finally able to solve this problem that I was having for the entire project. And that's that. This was probably one of the biggest undertakings I've done in a while for BBTAG, but nonetheless, even though I went a little insane doing it, it was pretty fun. This is also probably the most amount of effort I've put into a video. Like the last one, very experimental. This one especially so, with all the silly shenanigans I was getting up to, but in the future, I'll probably look into making more content like this. I know I asked previously if people were interested, and it seemed like I got a good reception. Regardless, if I did miss anything and you want to let me know, please leave a comment down below. And as always, my channel will be dedicated to giving you good BBTAG or otherwise related content in the future. But for now, this is Lonlily, signing off. And remember, maybe don't go to Kokohills. Yeah? Yeah.